the source sheet and let's get started. Okay, can everyone see it?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so we are in Parshat Pekudei, the conclusion of Sefer Shmot. Plugging right along. And let me put an extra plug for Shul this coming Shabbos. Rabbi Linzer will be with us, which is a true treat to be able to learn Torah from him. And then as a bonus, we're going to have our first hot meat kiddush in at least 2 years, probably longer. So,
Wow.
We are looking forward to that. So hope.
Wait, sorry. Is that going to be eaten inside on the deck?
No, we're still going to be on the deck. We're still on the deck.
Well, it won't be that long.
There will be designated servers in gloves and masks to serve the hot meat food. But it's a big step in the right direction, I think, and I hope.
Is Deborah Slowtower going to speak?
No, Rabbi Linzer's going to speak. I don't think she's coming. I'm not even sure that she's coming.
I'm sorry.
That's
Okay.
okay.
He's pretty good.
He's very good, as
I
a
know.
she. As a she. Okay, so Parshat Pekudei, and we're going to start at the very end. Okay, so this is the very conclusion of Sefer Shmot. We're not going to say Chazak tonight, though. We'll have to wait till Shabbos to say that as well. So we remember we've been dealing extensively with the Mishkan. We touched a little bit on why all the details are repeated last week, and over Shabbos we spoke a little bit about that. So here we have the very conclusion. Vayakam et hachatzer saviv lamishkan velamizbeach. Vayitin et masach shar hachatzer vayachal Moshe et hamalacha. He set up the chatzer, the courtyard, the enclosure around the Mishkan. And for the Mizbeach, he gave the covering, the screen, and Moshe completed the work of the tabernacle. The Mishkan is now done. The cloud covered the tent of meeting, and God's glory filled the Mishkan. Moshe could not enter the tent because God's presence, or because the cloud was dwelling over it, and God's glory filled the Mishkan. When the cloud lifted from the Mishkan, Bnei Yisrael would go for their journeys. If the cloud did not lift, then they did not travel. Because the cloud of God was on the Mishkan in the day, and fire at night for the eyes of all of Israel and all of their journeys. End of Sefer Shmot. Okay, so what's going on at the very conclusion? What happens once the Mishkan is concluded? What notes you as being of interest?
The presence remained with them, which is what Moshe had asked Hashem. He said, okay, well, an angel isn't enough to go with us. We want your presence to be with us.
Okay, so we'll come to that, but good. So God's presence is certainly with Bnei Yisrael, and as Anne correctly notes, that is seemingly in response to previous negotiations between Moshe and Hashem in order to get to that point.
It seems to be talking about two separate things: the cloud and God's presence. They seem to be in two different places. One
Okay.
above is
Good. So is the cloud and God's presence the same thing? Right. It seems not. The cloud is above the Mishkan, and it doesn't quite tell us this. But as I was reading through, it seems even a little. It says Moshe could not enter because the cloud was there. But then we read that the cloud remained there for the entire duration of their stay in the desert. Does that mean that Moshe, and presumably with Moshe, no one else could enter the entire time they were in the desert? That doesn't make any sense. So what exactly is the relationship between the cloud and God's presence? I don't have it fully fleshed out, but I think you're right, Gary. I think you're right to distinguish between the two. We have the cloud and we have God's presence. The cloud initially seems to maybe be one and the same, but then the cloud, I think we have to read as being separate, just because we know, right? I can't imagine it was the case that the Mishkan, all this effort was put into building it, and they could never actually go into worship in the Mishkan. That doesn't seem to be
I mean, Aaron had daily duty there.
right.
But it seems to be saying that the cloud was over the Mishkan and
Right.
God's presence was inside it.
Right, but except in verse 35, right? Lo yachol Moshe lavo el ohel moed, ki shachan alav he'anan. Moshe couldn't go into the tent of meeting because the cloud was over it. Uchvod Hashem alei the Mishkan, and God's honor, God's glory filled the Mishkan.
And
But
that
he's
would put
saying
in
the cloud was
the,
on top and the presence is inside. That very verse.
Okay, but the causative seems to be the cloud, right? If you read that verse, because the cloud was dwelling over it.
The cloud is a visible emanation
Yes.
of divine presence. And initially, at least for Moshe, it's if you're approaching a room, it's polite to knock on the door first,
Right.
before going in. And there's some people who are careful about that in their own homes, anywhere, just to be extra careful. And perhaps Moshe, at least initially, is so in awe that he can't bring himself to move in until he gets a very clear signal that he may enter.
Right. Well, he's not given a signal here that he can enter, right? All we would hear is he can't enter. And it could be, it could, I'm assuming, and maybe incorrectly, that if Moshe can't enter, then no one else can. It could be that Aaron could, and there was just Moshe was excluded. Or, I think the more plausible way of reading it, though, is that there was just a temporary time when Moshe, and I'm going to assume others, could not enter, but that was much more short-lived than the dwelling of the cloud the entire time they were traveling in the desert.
What is Moshe's function that would require him to enter the Mishkan?
It's the first.
Well, that's a good question. Nothing directly. He was a Levi, so he, in theory, could have helped just like all the other Levium did. But it was really Aaron. It was the Kohanim who served, and right, specifically not Moshe.
So they have a specific mitzvah that's involved.
Yeah. But again, presumably, once the Mishkan was up and running, anyone could enter. Anyone who met the criteria of not being tameh, not being impure, etc., etc. But just like the Beis Hamikdash was accessible, the Mishkan was accessible. They could bring their korbanos.
I think the cloud is a tool of Hashem.
Yeah.
And therefore Hashem can make the cloud do this or that. It's not like we're looking at the cloud as
Right.
being the commanding thing.
Okay. Right. But it's a good question about how God's presence in the Mishkan relates to the cloud.
But what about the terminology of the tent of meeting?
Yeah.
Doesn't that refer to the Kodesh and the Kodeshim? Kodesh HaKodeshim? It doesn't refer to the Azara. And Moshe would stand outside and would speak with Hashem. He was Hashem's prophet. That was what he needed, why he needed to be there whenever.
So
God
you
wanted
think
him to be there.
Ohel Moed is separate from Mishkan?
Yes, I do.
Okay, that's interesting. Because it says Kvod Hashem Alei et HaMishkan, that God's
Yeah, I
glory
know.
filled the
It's in
Mishkan.
parallel with one another. I realize that. But the tent of meeting that existed before the Mishkan was built was still called the tent of meeting because of the tablets in the Aron. The first Aron, right? And so the second one is also, and even today when we daven in the morning, we read that it's a moed because we can meet with Hashem there. you know.
Right,
correct?
right. And as we saw last week, right, there are those who read Ohel Moed as being Moshe's tent, completely separate from the Mishkan.
Oh,
Yeah,
sure.
it doesn't
Yeah,
seem
but-
that's the implied meaning here, but it's interesting. Maybe Ohel Moed is a further restriction, and maybe Moshe really wasn't ever able to go there.
Wouldn't that require him to go panim el panim, and Moses already had kind of, he had a black mark on him from hitting the rock?
That was later.
Not at this point.
Or it's later, sorry.
Well, that didn't seem to preclude Moshe from having panim el panim encounter with God. So it's if anything, we read that Moshe had the Karan or Panav, that he had the radiance of his face shining from the encounter with God, which would imply that he could get even closer. So the fact that he's not able to is quite interesting.
Does anybody comment on the nature of the Anan? Clouds in general are just water vapor. Sometimes clouds can be like smoke at like say at a wildfire.
Yeah. I don't. I've not seen anyone talk about that specific element, other than that it's something that was clearly visible to the nation, and to know that they could travel. We certainly hear midrashim about it being a protective cloud, but I don't know. I don't know what the nature of this cloud was. If it was smoke or if it was water, I don't know. It's a good question.
Well, if it's the pillar of cloud, it's different than, for example, the cloud that comes when Miriam and Aharon are to be rebuked. I mean, and in other places where people need to be rebuked, and Moshe and Aharon call on to Hashem to come to them, and it comes in the form of a cloud over them. But that's different than the cloud of smoke that comes up to announce the full acceptance in the installation of the Mishkan.
Right.
They sensed that Hashem's presence wasn't there until there was a fire and the smoke that came from there. So they're on a continuum, like Arthur was suggesting.
Yeah, for sure.
To do.
And it's interesting to note, just one more point on this first source is that it is Moshe who completes the entire building process. And remember, Moshe wasn't really involved in the actual building. Right? It was Bezalel, it was Oliav, it was all the men and women who had whatever skills that were required. Obviously Moshe was involved in communicating what was needed, but he was not directly involved in the construction, and yet he's the one who's able to who was given the honor of completing it, which is quite interesting also. Okay, so let's move on, and let me say now that this is what we're going to do tonight is very heavily influenced by Rabbi Foreman. In his he's only published so far in Bereshit and Shemot. My understanding is his plan is to publish books on all five of the Chumashim. So we're going to be saying goodbye not only to Sefer Shemot but to Rabbi Foreman largely till next year also. So anyway, this is heavily influenced by him, and some of you already looked ahead. He basically shows that there's a chiastic structure going on at the very, the entire second half of Sefer Shemot. And one of his chidushim, I don't think he's the first to note this chiastic structure, but he presents the chiasm very nicely. And then he has, another chiddush of his is that he, I think, extends it one step beyond where most extend it, and that is by identifying these clouds. So, right, to see, everyone knows what a chiastic structure is, or should we quickly just point that out now?
I don't.
Okay, so a chiastic structure is, in Hebrew, it's called etbesh, which is, if you look at what's being displayed here, so you have right? A story is introduced with one element, which we call A, and at the very end of the story, a parallel A element appears. So that serves as the envelope. And then there's a B element. Well, here we have, right, there's a few different common elements within A, but then we have B, right? So our A element is the clouds of God. And we're going to see, right, again, no spoilers, but right, that begins all the way back at the revelation at Sinai, where's the clouds of God. So that serves as the bookends of our literary unit. The second element is the commandment to build the Mishkan, and then the implementation of that commandment in the second half. We have laws of Shabbos discussed, and then in the chiastic structure, you're always looking for what is the one element that doesn't have a parallel. That becomes the central piece. So in our story, that's going to be the Chetza Egel, the golden calf. Okay, so in Hebrew, it's called etbesh, because you have aleph corresponding with taf, like beginning and end. Bet and shin is the second and second to last letters of the alphabet, and so it's referred to as etbesh. So that's roughly what a chiastic structure is, and it's a very common tool, and there's many who are tuned into it and like to point out chiastic structures in many of the stories and units of Tanakh. And so that's what we're going to be exploring tonight, is this chiasm at the end of Sefer Shemot. Is that now everyone's on the good page on what chiasm is, or any more questions on that?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so back to let's go to source number 2 now. This is going to be the very beginning. So now that we've seen that there is, right, the Sefer Shemot ends with this clouds and description of Moshe's inability to enter the Mishkan, that should have triggered for us something earlier in Sefer Shemot, and that earlier thing is at the end of what we think of the end of the unit of Har Sinai, chapter 24, the end of Parshat Mishpatim. We read, right, this is sort of a retelling of Moshe's going up to get the Aseret Dibrot. Vaya'al Moshe el Hahar, vayachas ha'anan et hahar. Moshe goes up the mountain, and the cloud covers the mountain. Vayishkan kvod Hashem al Har Sinai, v'yachaseu anan sheshet yamim, vayikra el Moshe b'yom hashvi mitoch anan. God, the glory of God dwells on Har Sinai, and it covers the cloud for 6 days, and God calls Moshe on the 7th day from within the cloud. Marei kvod Hashem ke'esh ochelet b'rosh hahar. The appearance of the glory of God looked like a fire. So we have the fire element as well that we saw at the end of Sefer Shemot. At least that's what appeared to Bnei Yisrael. Vayavo Moshe b'toch ha'anan, vayal el hahar, vayhi Moshe b'har 40 yom ו40 לילה. Moshe went into the cloud, and he went up the mountain, and he was on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. Okay, so again, we have a cloud description and focus on Moshe's ability to access or not access where the cloud is. A couple of key differences between the beginning and the end is, number one, right, the accessibility. At the end of the Sefer, Moshe is not able to enter into the Mishkan when God's glory, when Kvod Hashem is manifest in the Mishkan, whether that's in the cloud or in the Mishkan itself. At the beginning, we're told that God's glory is there, and Moshe is able to enter. Moshe is able to climb up and enter wherever it is that God's glory is found. So that's a key difference between these two cloud appearances. Any other differences that strike you? Any other details that are either similar or different?
I'm struck by the fact that kavod, which could mean presence or glory, by root means heavy.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's something which is of weightiness, right? We would translate maybe as weightiness as a way to.
I mean, in hippie talk, it all makes sense. That's
right,
heavy.
right. Back to the Future. I remember Michael J. Fox is always saying, "Wow, that's heavy. That's heavy."
I'm a little behindhand on movies.
Okay, well, that's one you should catch up on. That's a great movie.
Isn't that sort of like Kavod Hashem is like the honorable?
Yeah, but Gary's saying that the word is translated as honor and also as weight or heavy, kaved. So I think that they are connected, right? Something which is heavy, which is weighted, is of greater value, of greater significance. So that's how those words are connected. Okay, so Rabbi Foreman and Ann already clued us into this first observation that he makes. Source number 3, the holiness of God's cloud in the tabernacle is so intense that Moshe can't even enter the space. God is so very present in the Mishkan, this climactic moment, that although man has made the space, man can no longer enter it. The conclusion seems clear. However much God was present at the moment of revelation itself at Mount Sinai, that is a veritable drop in the bucket compared to the intensity of the divine presence that comes into our world once the tabernacle is completed. Not even Moshe, the one human being privy to an otherworldly epiphany at Sinai, can enter. It's a stunning victory for the children of Israel, a true validation of what they have made with their own hands, with the gifts that came from their own hearts. Okay, so the conclusion of Sefer Shmot, by Moshe's inability to enter the Mishkan, is showing that the Mishkan has a higher concentration of God's presence than even Har Sinai did at the moment of revelation. That's the conclusion he thinks we're supposed to take from this.
It's smaller, so it would be more dense, so to speak.
More you're saying maybe this is to be expected because it's the same presence of God, more concentrated. Okay, I hear that. That's an interesting take. Certainly that is true physically speaking. I read that observation more in line of the Ramban, right? The Ramban famously, we mentioned this last week also, famous debate between Rashi and the Ramban about when the command to build the Mishkan was given. Was it a lichatchila ideal, this was always part of the plan? Or was it a b'di'eved, a sort of compensation to the fact that Bnei Yisrael committed the sin of the golden calf and needed both a way of atoning for that sin and a way of not entering into that pitfall again? The Mishkan served that purpose. That's Rashi's position. The Ramban says that it was always the plan to have the Mishkan, and that the Mishkan was supposed to be a way of perpetually carrying the Har Sinai experience with them throughout the desert. And so if the Ramban is correct and Rabbi Foreman is correct, we're seeing it's not only bringing that experience with us through the desert, but it really is a even better, in some sense, manifestation and replication of that experience, in that, right, as seen by the fact that God's presence is more intensely felt in the Mishkan than it was at Har Sinai.
I would just like to add that this is what happened when Hashem called Moshe up onto the mountain. But in the description before the Aseret Dibros, there are even more layers of concealment. There's there are 3 of them actually, I believe. There is a dark cloud. There is a consuming kind of cloud, and there's another kind of darkness, and so on. So for him to make this kind of a sweeping statement, I think is a little bit of an exaggeration. I found that he does that a lot. He will make a point and then he'll exaggerate it and leave out often some salient other points. So the whole people did experience something that was even they were seeing what they were hearing what they were seeing. They felt like they had a tentative grasp, shall we say, on their material reality. They were overwhelmed by those words that Hashem shared with them, and but before that, all of these other things having to do with clouds and fire and darkness. So that's really
fair
overwhelming.
enough. I hear the critique. I will say that even in his book, he says that he this is just kind of a bird's eye overview of this chiasm that he sees, and that if he really delves into it in much more detail on his website with the audio recordings, you have to pay to get. I think you get there's a free trial thing, but you have to pay to get access to those audio and video presentations. So I think in fairness, he does recognize a lot more details and get into it more than what we're going to be able to do tonight. But you're right. There's not. First of all, it's not going to be an exact parallel in each case, and be interesting to maybe spend some time and see within this first element if there's a chiastic element
Oh, sure,
of
there
the
is.
cloud. Yeah. So
Sure,
what
there
that
is.
centerpiece of this mini chiasm would be interesting to see. But the point is well taken. But I think that he certainly recognizes that what he does, even
Yeah.
in the chapter in his book,
Yeah,
is
it's a
not
good point.
comprehensive.
Yeah, sure. He has a good point. But the implications of all of this for the study of Torah are what I would love to hear you speak about further, because in the first case, we have the Aseres Dibros that are just overwhelming to the people. And they supposedly, according to some, they heard only the first two. That's all they could take. And then Moshe even had to give them the others. But then Hashem asks them to come up. And it's like they have an extremely intense seminar for 40 days and 40 nights.
Yeah.
And now we have the situation where Moshe, when the people would come out to him at the tent of meeting, they have a question, it has something to do with Torah, halacha, something Hashem would be telling them. He's got to have all these different modes of constant communication with Hashem in one form or another. And I think Rabbi Foreman has a very good point here. I really do. I love the point. I just wish you would have developed it a little bit differently. So.
Okay. Fair enough. Okay, so let's go on and just see some of these elements. So again, back on the final page, I'm not going to scroll back and forth. I'm going to give everyone motion sickness, but so our element A of our chiasm is the cloud of God. Within that, he points out in A1 and in A2, but we have the cloud is covering the focal location. It's covering the Har Sinai, and it covers the Mishkan. And then we have this consuming fire in both instances, and the key difference being at Har Sinai, Moshe is able to enter into the cloud / consuming fire, and in the Mishkan, he's not able to. And so one takeaway is that the Mishkan shows that there's even a higher, more intense concentration of God's presence than at Har Sinai, which shows some sort of victory for Bnei Yisrael, that they're able to achieve what they thought was unachievable. Okay, so that's element number one. Element number two, so element number 2b is the commandment to build the Mishkan. So we have that in source number 4. I'll show you the English. Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe le'emor, daber b'nei Yisrael v'yichlu li truma me'et kol ish asher yidvenu libo tikhu et trumati. So the commandments to gather donations from everyone whose heart so moves them. Zot truma asher tichu meitam, and it used to be gold and silver, etc., etc. And that's from chapter 25 through chapter 31, right? What we read the past, we've been reading in shul the past month or so. All the details of the Mishkan beginning in Parshat Tetzaveh. Right, so then we come in chapter 31. At the end, after we're given all the details of the Mishkan, everything that has to go into it, all of the Pekudei kahuna, the priestly clothing, everything, it's interrupted by this commandment for Shabbos, right? You should keep my Shabbos because it's a sign between me and your generations. to know that I am God who makes you holy. Shmartem et Shabbos, ki kodesh hi lachem. You should observe Shabbos because it's holy for you. Mechalaleha mot yumat. Those who desecrate it will be put to death. Ki kol aseh bo malachav nichotana v'shahim me'ker ameha. Anyone who does malacha, who does forbidden work, will be cut off. Sheshit yamim te'aseh malacha, etc., etc. So we have the description of the Mishkan interrupted by Shabbos. And so there's a lot that's said about why this is juxtaposed, why Shabbos comes in the middle of the story of the Mishkan, right? The two most famous elements are, number one, to teach us that we might have thought that building the Mishkan is so important and so crucial, right? It's such an important piece of our national identity that it might override Shabbos, that we might be able to be involved in building the Mishkan even on Shabbos. Nope. So lesson number one is that the laws of Shabbos remain in place, and we cannot be Machal Shabbos in order to build the Mishkan. And number two is through the juxtaposition, the rabbis in the Gemara learn out that the 39 avot melachot, the 39 prohibited forms of work on Shabbos, are those same acts that were required for the building of the Mishkan. So those are the two most important and most common, most popular explanations for why the laws of Shabbos come in the context of the Mishkan. There's much more that's said about that, but we have the commandment of Shabbos, and then in at the beginning of Parshat Vayakhel last week, source number 7, we again have Vayakhel Moshe et kol adat b'nei Yisrael vayomer alehem ela dvei asher tzivah Hashem lasot otam. Moshe gathers the people and he tells them this is what God commands you to do. Sheshet yamim te'asem melacha v'yom hashvi yelachem kodesh Shabbat Shabbaton Hashem kol ha'oseh melacha yumat. So again, we have the general gathering of the people to tell them to build the Mishkan or to implement the plan of building the Mishkan, and immediately interrupted by the laws of Shabbos. So we have the same basic structure as we had beforehand. And then after Shabbos he goes into all the details and implementing what had been commanded in the construction of the Mishkan. So our chiasm holds true. Right? So we have, again, cloud of God, element A. Commandment for the Mishkan is B, followed by Shabbos. And then on the flip side of it, remember the golden calf is going to be the center point. So on the flip side of it, we have Shabbos followed by the command or the implementation of building the Mishkan and concluding with the cloud of glory. One more element that he sees in our chiasm is at the beginning of chapter 32, which is the description of the Chet HaEgel, the sin of the golden calf. We have the verb vayikahel. Back in source number 6, said I wasn't going to make everyone scroll back and forth too much. So the beginning of the story of the sin of the golden calf, I'll get the English for you on the screen and I'll read the Hebrew. Vayar ha'am ki boshesh Moshe lavedet min hahar. People saw that Moshe was delayed in coming down from the mountain. Vayikahel ha'am al Aharon. Vayomer elav kum aseh lanu Elokim asher yilchu lefanenu. Ki zeh Moshe ish asher lanu me'eretz Mitzrayim lo yadanu mehayalo. And they gather to Aaron. They say to him, make for us a God who will go before us, because this Moshe, who took us out of Egypt, we don't know what happened to him. So then Aaron tells them to take jewelry, and the whole story of the golden calf ensues from there. So Vayikahel, right, is the same verb that introduces Parshat Vayakhel. So that's another element in the chiasm. You could really delve into it and find significance in why specifically this verb. I think for our purposes and for other performance purposes, at least in the book, again, I didn't listen to the audio recordings. He says that this is more of an element just to show that this chiasm holds true and that it's intentional, more than the specifics about why this particular verb. Although I'm sure we could find much meaning and why specifically it's this verb that is the one that clues us into the existence of this chiasm. Okay, so then we have, our focus point is the golden calf. We know the story more or less, and we're not going to go into the details of it now, but let's go to source number 9, which is where he begins to unpack this entire phenomenon. Okay. So our center point is the golden calf. What catalyzed the building of the golden calf? According to the text, Moshe was late coming down the mountain. The people feared he had died and was never returning to them. Ramban, for one, argues on this basis that the people, in building this calf, were seeking a replacement of sorts for Moses. They needed a way to accomplish what Moses was supposed to do for them, establish a connection with the divine on behalf of the people. In other words, Moshe was supposed to be their vehicle to connect to God. Now there would be another vehicle, this calf. It was a failed experiment, an illegitimate and ineffective way of bringing God into the material world. But there were other legitimate and wonderful ways to achieve this. How can one actually bring God into the material world? Through the twin elements that bracket the golden calf episode, through Shabbos and the Mishkan. Okay, so the golden calf, as being the center point of our chiasm, is supposed to be the illustration of what was totally wrong and mistaken, right? The reason why it's bracketed and introduced, then followed immediately by both the Torah's description of Shabbos and the Mishkan, is to teach us that if they wanted to really achieve closeness with God, they were already given the tools with which to do it. They already were given the Mishkan and they were given Shabbos. What's the significance of the Mishkan and Shabbos? What does Shabbos represent?
Holiness within the home.
Holiness within the home, certainly.
And the Mishkan is an external.
Okay, so that's
locus of
beautiful. So we
holiness.
have a focus on the private, on the family, on the home, and on the communal.
Yeah.
That's certainly true, that we can connect closest with God in our homes. We can achieve it in community. That might be one of the reasons why that word vayakel is so prominent.
Holiness in time versus holiness in place.
Say that again, Gary.
Holiness in time brackets holiness in place.
Okay, so that's what many point out as well, and we write that Shabbos represents a way to connect with God in time, by sanctifying time, by setting aside time, and the Mishkan shows how we can achieve closeness with God through space, through sanctification of space. The person who says this most beautifully is, of course, Rabbi Heschel, his book, The Sabbath. We don't need to read the entire quote, but his book, The Sabbath, argues that Shabbos becomes primary in Judaism to show that Judaism is all about the sanctuary and time, about how we're able to achieve and connect with God. I'll just read that middle paragraph. Jewish ritual may be characterized as the art of significant forms in time, as architecture of time. Most of its observances, Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, the festivals, the sabbatical, the Shemitah, the Yovel year, depend on a certain hour of the day or season of the year. It is, for example, the evening, morning, or afternoon that brings with it the call to prayer. The main theme of faith lie in the realm of time. We remember the day of the Exodus from Egypt, the day when Israel stood at Sinai, and our messianic hope is the expectation of a day of the end of days. Skipping one paragraph. It is two paragraphs. This is a radical departure from the accustomed religious thinking. The mythical mind would expect that after heaven and earth have been established, God would create a holy place, a holy mountain or a holy spring whereupon a sanctuary is to be established. Yet it seems as if to the Bible, it is holiness in time, the Shabbos, which comes first. Okay, so that's Heschel's beautiful take on this. But certainly we have in the Torah is emphasizing the idea that we can connect with Hashem through right sanctification, through holy places and through holy times, and that's why Shabbos and Mishkan come as the brackets of the sin of the golden calf.
In the
Okay.
context of these partial, Shabbos is differentiated from the others because their eagerness to build the tabernacle can't supersede Shabbos. So
Right, right,
that's the theme in both cases.
right, and that supports perhaps Heschel saying that time is even more important than space. Very good. Okay, so one more piece in understanding this whole thing, and this again brings us back to our beginning with the clouds, and Anne alluded to this observation that Rabbi Foreman makes. But in the aftermath of the golden calf, right, as Moshe is begging God for forgiveness, so Hashem says, okay, fine, I'll forgive you. I'm in source number 11. God says, Lo e'ele b'kirbcha ki am kshe orif ata pen achelka baderech. I will not be in your midst because you are a stiff-necked people. I'm afraid that I'm going to destroy you on the way. When the people hear this, they mourn. They don't put their adornments on them. Vayomer Hashem al Moshe, Amor b'nei Yisrael, atem am kshe oref, rega echad ele b'kirbcha v'chiliticha, tzah et yacha mi'alecha ve'edam ma'aselach. Okay, so God says, you are a stiff-necked, tells Moshe to tell the people that you're a stiff-necked people, and I'm going to destroy you in one moment. Therefore, remove your adornments from you. I'll know what to do with you. So they take off whatever adornments they had from Har Choref, from the Sinai.
Okay.
I'm just looking for the key pasuk. Okay. I think I didn't include the pasuk with the angel, right? But right in this context, God says, I'm not going to be with you. My angel will lead you through the desert and into Eretz Yisrael. And this is what the people reject, and this is what Moshe petitions for. So now, remember, what do we say happens at the end of Sefer Shemot? We have another manifestation of the cloud with God's glory, with God's presence. And it's at that manifestation that Moshe is not able to enter. So Rabbi Foreman says as follows, source number 12. Sorry. Bit by bit, the children of Israel claw back. They don't take no for an answer. They actually mourn when they hear that only an angel will lead them. Although they seemingly have everything, they won't be destroyed. They will be able to go into the land. Still, they mourn the loss of closeness with their Maker. Their desire to have God's presence rest among them is palpable. Moshe, representing the people, even goes so far as to tell the Almighty that he won't lead the people. Don't even bother to take us out of here at all. Slowly, the people rebuild their relationship with God. Finally, at the end of the book of Exodus, at the outer edge of our chiasm, a crowning moment arrives. God does come to dwell within the people after all. It is not some watered down, dim shadow of the divine presence that comes now among the people. The divine comes among them with such intensity that it dwarfs the actual Sinai experience itself. Flawed and humbled post-sin man has made a place for God in his all too human world. God fills that place with more intensity, vigor, and holiness than Israel could ever have thought possible. Okay, so at the end, right, the end of Sefer Shemot, and it's interesting because he fits it in the chiasm. We normally think of the centerpiece of the chiasm as being the most important, but really it's because of the chiasm that we've discovered that we can appreciate the conclusion of Sefer Shemot, the significance of this manifestation of God in the Mishkan that even Moshe can't go into. Okay, it's because of the intense tshuva that they've been involved with, Moshe and then the entire people refusing to accept any compromise. right? We said that maybe the Mishkan originally was intended to be an internal model perpetuation of Har Sinai. So we've even gone beyond that, right? Through our intense prayer, intense desire to have God among us, we're able to achieve even greater than we had originally thought or had originally experienced as a result, which is a very powerful conclusion to the book. Any thoughts, any questions on that?
Well, you could add it to the chiasm by creating another category above it, that Hashem appeared on Har Sinai and intensely revealed himself to them. And then at the bottom, that would be another one. And also, by the way, I think that gold area at the bottom there, consuming fire, Moshe could not enter.
That should be could not enter.
Don't forget to
my
put the word not
my Excel sheet got cut off.
if you plan to, share
Thank
this
you.
or-
Yes, I'll have to fix that. Thank you.
Yeah, but the chiasm could be expanded. That's all.
Yeah,
I
For
just-
sure.
Mhm.
Okay, so we have a very powerful conclusion then to Sefer Shmot, and to this entire Mishkan project, right? The question we keep asking over and over and over again is, why is so much time, energy, and space devoted to the Mishkan? I think that this gives us a very powerful answer to why the Torah goes into so much detail and why it repeats, knowing the repetition is coming as framing moments of the Chet HaEgel, of the golden calf, and why that was so important. I think adds a very rich detail and a very rich layer to our understanding of Sefer Shmot.
Yes, it does.
All right.
In Sefer HaChinuch,
Yeah,
the assertion is that the temple and all the vestments, everything in it, are perfection.
right.
And every detail of it is perfection,
hmm
and so on and so forth. So I have a very powerful feeling, along with that.
Yeah. I mean, the emphasis on perfection, we've spoken about that in years past also. It's on the one hand, yes, it's perfect, and right, it should be in order to house God, but there's some troubling elements to that perfection as well, right? In that a Kohen who is a Baal Mum, who has any sort of physical deformity, who isn't able to serve. So right, there's ways of addressing and talking about that, but it raises some other interesting questions as well. So anyway, we've made it through the first two Svarim of Chumash, and thank God we're going strong. Next week we'll start Sefer Vayikra. I'm looking forward to that. Thank you everyone for your great questions and insights, and hopefully that'll continue as we make our way through the rest of Chumash, Sefer Vayikra next week. If there's nothing else, we'll say Laila Tov.
So thank you so much, Rabbi.
Okay,
Thank you so very much for putting all this together.
thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Oops.
Wow.